I'll just let Erin take it away, and I will say, if you have questions about the exhibition, the curator is here. So how these programs typically run, if you haven't been here, is we have the responder, and then we have sort of a Q&A conversation afterwards. So if you do have questions that pop up, feel free to fire away at the Q&A section. Erin, take it away.
I'm excited to see so many of you here, honestly. I mean, I imagined that an evening out here in the courtyard, this could be a really popular event, and I thought at lunch, I don't know how many people in Reston are going to pop over to Grace for a little program, but I shared with Sarah that I've taught classes smaller than this, so this is great. I like it. My name is Aaron Stratten, and I wear lots of different hats, as you started to hear. And I have to say, I suspected the story that Lily shared when I got the invite to come to this, because I thought, oh, you know, an email from Grace. What are we going to work on connected to art education now? That's my 9 to 5, right? I'm the art education specialist for Fairfax County Public Schools. So if you know an art teacher, I work with them. I know that person, right? That's my connection out to all of our different schools. But that note had a different tone to it. It was like, wait, and then I don't know who it was that made the decision to invite me, but I have to give Erica some credit here, because the invitation and the information about this exhibition talks about world building. It talks about fantasy and fiction and science fiction and science, and then they invited me from the perspective of a person working in the bonsai community, and I thought, okay, do they know I'm all of these things? Because I'm a little bit like sci-fi obsessed from my childhood, and I've not been able to let that go when I teach. So a little more of the art education background. Right now I work in the central office and work with all of the art teachers. Prior to that, at least here in Fairfax County, I was a high school art teacher. I have taught at George Mason University, working with pre-service art teachers, those graduate level students learning to become art teachers. And even in those roles, I have found ways to bring in not just ideas of fantasy, science fiction, science, and world building, but this kind of way of bringing all of my interests together. So I've had high school students do these long extended units where their artworks that they're creating are building worlds and building imaginary places and spaces. So I have lots of connections to it, but I was invited to talk from a perspective of bonsai, so I shall, which is very dangerous. You have no idea what you've done. I have been keeping trees alive, as I like to say, for over 20 years. I became fascinated with bonsai as an art form in '96 or so. And I thought, ooh, interesting, got a book, I got a tree. And I got another book, got another tree. And then I did what happens to so many bonsai practitioners, where you start seeing the world differently all of a sudden. And you look around and you're like, oh, there's this strange little tree growing up out of the corner of my garden bed. I wonder if I should put that in a pot and keep it forever and train it to be something. So my perspective changed, and I was obsessed with trees, and I've kept trees and grown my collection over the years. And in fact, I wasn't very involved with the bonsai community in terms of clubs. The Bonsai Society here is actually a great organization that's been around actually as long as I have, since the early 70s. And it's a great organization, but I didn't even join that organization until a few years ago, after I'd already been practicing bonsai for nearly 20 years at that point. And somehow I've already managed to become president. I don't know what that's all about. But the world of bonsai is fascinating. The reality of it is, much like the world of art, that you'll never learn it all. You'll never understand it all. There is so much to it. But at the same time, there is a simplicity to it. So who knows what bonsai is? What is bonsai?
It's creating something that looks mature in miniature, that is aesthetic and causes pleasure.
Absolutely. And then, does anybody want to attempt an actual translation of the word? Because this is like a deeper definition than just a direct translation. So if you take bonsai, bone and sai, it's tree and pot. Okay? In fact, it's plant in tray. Maybe. I mean, exact translations, right? But a tree and a pot. And that's the literal translation, but exactly what you said. It is more of an aesthetic process. It is an art form. It is the idea of trying to represent something that is more than that. And that's a fascinating connection to the art world in general. To me, anytime you place a work of art on a pedestal or hang something on the wall with a frame around it, all of a sudden that object takes on a different essence, a different quality, and we look at it in a different way. And in the same sense, you can take a plant and you can apply certain strategies to adjust how that plant looks, and you put it in a pot, and all of a sudden you can call it a bonsai. For years and years, I called every tree that I had a potensai, because I didn't want to claim that I owned a bonsai. The world of bonsai is a fascinating one that I could talk on forever, but that's not really why I was invited to come either. It was to talk about this exhibition and how that relates through this perspective, and that idea of world building and of kind of inventing these spaces or thinking about the worlds that we can imagine is a really fascinating and easy connection for me, and it really comes down to the way that we look at what is presented to us here in these works, and the connection I want to make is one with how we display bonsai and what that process is and what it means. I have to say, as I go through the exhibition, I brought this to make sure I didn't do anybody any injustices by messing up names. The Timothy Harper stuff, which is right back here, this is definitely the stuff that grabs my attention first from this perspective, right? There's the plant elements, that branch that he places into his music box assemblages, and that branch that comes up in the branching or display of the flower elements and things like that. That natural piece is what grabs my attention, and from this perspective, it's like, okay, there's this natural piece, here's the plant object, even if this is a dead stick, right? Same visual element, and it's in something, it's on something, right? Something's holding it there, and what is around it, and in some cases, they're completely encased in glass, right? All of this is creating a way to look at that as a representation of the natural world, right? So when we look at bonsai, we're looking at, here's a representation, a way of an artist presenting something to you to represent something bigger in the natural world, right? This is supposed to not just be a tiny little plant in a pot, but to actually give us the idea of a much bigger tree, right? That's the intent of bonsai. So the elements of a stick or a flower or a dried piece of vegetation of some sort here gives us that same point, that same piece where we look at it and we start to imagine a whole world perhaps inside this enclosed glass case. And what is that world and what are the natural elements of that world? And then to me it becomes, how are we presenting that and what does it say about that world? And that's where it really connects to me with the way that we display bonsai. So this is a fascinating and contentious world all by itself, because the way we displayed bonsai, if you say that in the United States, automatically, at least within the bonsai community, gets people thinking, okay, well, are you talking about a Japanese tradition? Or are you talking about, something maybe that we're moving toward? Because in the US, we are trying to figure out what it means to have American bonsai, right? This is an art form that people recognize as being from Japan. Japan is still in many parts of the world, and practitioners within the art form considered to be the epitome of bonsai. But Japan has a particular style. They have particular plants they work with. They have particular ways that they do things, particular ways they want things to look, particular rules, right? And we have to remind ourselves it's an art form, and anytime we have rules, we're like, well, hang on a second, what are you telling me, rules? There's a way this is supposed to look or supposed to be. And so in the US, we're trying to figure out what American bonsai is. And so we're starting to look at what are the plant material in America that we can use to create good bonsai. And that's a starting point. And then we start looking at, okay, wait, what was the other most important part other than the tree and the pot, right? So then we start looking at pots, because again, that piece of ceramics, if you bought that from a Japanese kiln, a Japanese ceramics artist who's creating ceramic work for displaying bonsai, that can have really high valuation, like extremely, like people pay thousands to have one ceramic pot shipped over, right? Because it came from that particular artist and there's that particular stamp on the bottom, right? So what is American material? What is American ceramics in this context, right? And then the display, to get back to that idea again, is what I really see this strong connection to with Harper's work, because the way we present these, every element of the display changes what we can think about what we're seeing, okay? So let's talk about this for a minute, and then I want to go back to some of the artworks here. So if you look at this tree, this isn't fair. Let me start with something first. Does anybody have any idea what type of actual plant material this is?
Green.
Green? Excellent. This is a boxwood. Does anybody know boxwood or have boxwood? Yeah, right. It's just a shrub, right? It's a bush. I have some in my garden, in my yard, right? It's just a boxwood, okay? So one giant bonsai myth. Bonsai is not a kind of tree or a kind of plant. Bonsai is any tree or plant that is trained and cared for in a particular way and displayed to look like an old tree in a pot, okay? So this is a boxwood. It's just a shrub. It's a bush. But if you were to look at this and think of it as a bigger, older tree, tell me about this tree. Where is it? What kind of tree does it remind you of?
An
Or
oak.
any place? I'm sorry?
An oak tree.
Okay, so maybe any number of deciduous trees that we might have. Where do you think this deciduous tree might be growing relative to other things around it in an environment? What's the environment that this would be? Okay, something hot? Why do you say hot?
Because it's not real bushy.
Okay.
It's not full.
It's not real full and lush, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of spaces in here, right? So when you look at, you guys familiar with the baobab?
Yes.
Those big African trees with the giant thick trunks, and then they like have a little bit of branching up here, and there's some green across the top, and they're like this little solar panel that's just like, come on, son. But it's supporting this gigantic plant, right? And that like little bit of green on a huge plant is because it's in this hot kind of space. Now, when we take that tree and we can start making some judgments about what kind of tree is that, okay, maybe kind of like a deciduous tree that we would see, an oak perhaps, that's growing out there, and it's a very hot place because it doesn't have to be really big and full and lush. Then we add other elements to it and it tells us more about this place. So then we look at a companion plant like this one. So if I put a plant here, well, what are we looking at here? We have grass, so what does that say? Does it tell you anything about where this tree is.
You're thinking of the two together?
Right, exactly. And maybe that's my point that I want to share with you. So when we display bonsai, we put our tree here, we put something here, and we think about the two together and what that says,
Yeah.
right? So we have grass. Okay, some grassy place where it's hot, right? It's sunny, and we've got some grass growing, and the green grass would suggest that it's summer, right? So we might have the essence of a season as well. Now, if I were to take something like this,
Okay, you just went from
Instead-
savanna to desert.
what's that?
You just went from savanna to
Oh,
desert.
now I've just changed the environment because I've changed the companion bit with it, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, how about if I do something like this?
Coastline.
Mountain.
Peninsula, Pebble Beach.
Okay, so now we're seeing something that suggests a different environment. So the pieces that go together start creating the story, right? A very traditional Japanese bonsai display will include usually 3 parts: a tree, an accent that may or may not be a plant, and oftentimes a scroll, which would hang on the wall. I knew I wouldn't have a wall right here, so I didn't bring it. I didn't do that, right? The object that's over here, which may or may not be a plant, can tell us some other things. So, anybody know what this is?
Pagoda type thing.
Right? Little pagoda lamp, little traditional Japanese garden element, right?
Right.
So now where's my tree?
Garden.
And then, oh hey, did somebody say something about the beach? We don't need to throw everything. Now what if I do that? All right, so what we put with the tree tells a story, okay? And I kept things simple.
That's Expedia.
I kept things simple and just brought this bamboo mat today. Often the trees are displayed on stands. The stand can be taller or shorter. Sometimes they're detailed, sometimes they're very simple. Sometimes these are on stands. I promise the last pieces. Somebody said something about like a beach space earlier. Anybody know what that is?
Seashell.
Oh, it's a background.
Yep. So
What is it?
there could possibly be elements on stands raised to different levels and that sort of thing. So each one of these combinations tells a different story. So when we look at some of these examples of the work in the exhibition, we see something that can suggest a part of the natural world, and then there's all these other elements around it, and we have to read each one of those elements to try and figure out what the story is, right? Where are we talking about? And when I look at that stuff, I also think, when are we talking about, right? So, you know, when you think about all these different parts, and this is really also kind of just a parallel to art. You create an artwork, if you're an artist creating a composition, every element can change the story, right? Take these chunks away, take these stones so that there's no stone and it's all glass, and we change the story, right? If we have this composition here, you know, does the fact that there are 5 figures on this side make a lot of difference? What would happen if that was 3? Or if we rotate this into a different arrangement? Each arrangement decision, each element makes a huge difference. And then, you know, just, I don't know, FYI, these things get judged when you are at a really high level of bonsai, which is not. I still am keeping trees alive, right? But to put together a formal display, that might be judged in a formal type of setting where they're really looking at exactly, you know, exactly how this was placed. Is this here or is this here? And how much of a difference does that make? How close is it? How far away? So, you know, I encourage you to look around the exhibition and think a little bit about that. How are those elements playing parts together? There is a fantastic quote that I kept trying to lock into my head from, is that Booker over there? Michael Booker, that basically all the participants in those drawings are leaving behind evidence in the world, I'm paraphrasing now, in the world that they're interacting with, and they're leaving their histories and their stories behind into that. And so even as you look at a drawing, it doesn't have to be this artwork with a plant element that you can relate to bonsai, right? That idea that a story is there, and that story is told by those different elements that are put together in that particular way, I think becomes a fascinating way to look at the work in the exhibition. I would be more than happy to answer any of your questions about bonsai when we are having public events, exhibitions. There are inevitably a ton of questions about this art form. Northern Virginia Bonsai Society is an organization that spans a pretty large area, and if any of you are interested in learning more, then you're more than welcome to join us sometime and get more information, come out to a meeting and see what types of things we do. So thank you all.
Thank you, Aaron.
What kind of questions do you have?
I have a question. Did you personally shape that boxwood?
Yes, this actually, I have a pretty full history for this tree. I picked it up off of the curb at somebody's trash can about 13 years ago. And when I did, it was a larger plant than this, and I plopped it into a pot with some soil just to make sure that it wasn't dead. I had new growth on it the following year, and so at the next time that I wanted to repot it, I actually took it, and I honestly don't know if I can remember at this point, but at some point I actually split it into two different plants. So this has a sister plant at home that is a different style, kind of a twin trunk, but it's literally the same plant that I split in two and had two survivors. And so beyond that, it has been a matter of choosing which branches I wanted to stay. Yes, styling this with a lot of pruning. The pruning on boxwood can be very detail-oriented, and then some wiring as well. I had a wire on here that I considered removing for today, but I thought, nah, if somebody is interested in knowing more about wire, we'll leave that little bit there. So wire is actually, I mean, a huge, at least 20th century, 21st century bonsai tool. Wrap the wire around a branch, bend the branch to the place that you want it, the wire holds it there, and then the tree, as it continues growing and creating new layers of woody tissue, creates those new layers of woody tissue in that position so that when you remove the wire, the branch stays there, right? So that's the idea. So yes, wiring and pruning to get all of this shape. It was just a bush in somebody's yard when they decided they didn't want it anymore, dug it up and threw it up by the trash.
I'm curious about the roots because I worked in a building in College Park, and 5 years after they did the landscaping and everything, and we had a problem with cherry blossom trees in pots on the deck. So they brought this expert from the University of Maryland Agriculture.
They were getting root bound, weren't
He said it was like they lasted. He said they wouldn't last much longer because it was a bonsai effect. And he said the roots, it was like drinking out the teeny tiny straw. That the water could. I didn't really
they?
understand.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting, but they replaced it with crepe myrtle.
Okay. So.
And he said that the landscape people inevitably don't cooperate with the architecture people, and they just throw something in.
Right. This will look good here now.
Yeah, and it did for about 5 years.
Right. So
And then it killed it.
the rule number one for bonsai is keep your tree alive. And there's way too many people in the world who don't like accept and embrace that fact. And those people that I'm referring to are the people who, you know, find what I like to refer to as boohoo bonsai, like the bonsai you can buy at Lowe's or Walmart, right? There's this tiny little like thing that someone styled and put in a pot and probably glued some rocks onto it and put one of those little tiny clay figures there. All right, I can tell by the face of some of you on one of those. It's okay. So you buy this tree and then you take it home and then like they're like, oh, I have a bonsai, and they know they have to water it, right? And then, but they may not be sure about what else to do. And so rule number one is keep your tree alive, and people want to take it home and like as soon as it grows, like, oh yes, I can clip it now. Now I'm a bonsai person because I'm pruning my tree, right? But if your tree gets weak, like the example that you're sharing, even though these are in bigger trees in bigger pots, then there's no point, right? So there is another interesting kind of parallel that I make when you think about, like, look at this thing. Like, what is it about like an enclosed glass globe that makes you feel like the whole world's inside? Is it like the Men in Black effect? Like, do you remember Men in Black when like there was like a universe inside the marble? But that kind of concept, the universe is inside that, that's actually really true right here. And as a bonsai practitioner, you have to accept that you are the whole world to the tree, right? We reduce the tree's access to water, to nutrients, to whatever it is that we put in this pot. And we want to put everything in there that the tree needs so that it can be strong and it can be healthy. But if we don't put everything in there that it needs, we're going to have an unhealthy plant. And so we reduce that world to this, but at the same time, we need to make sure that that world inside this is going to be healthy. And so repotting is a very important part of maintaining bonsai, depending on the plant, how old it is, what type of species you're dealing with, how strong and healthy and vigorous it has been, and how fast it grows will determine how often you repot a tree. I have some trees that I repot annually. Every spring, I will remove them from the pot. I will, brush a little bit of the soil off to see how the roots are doing, stretch out those roots that have grown long and been trying to find a place to go inside that pot, prune those back so that there's a little bit of space inside this pot for those roots to grow. And actually, when you do that, you create a growth response in the tree. It doesn't weaken them or make them less able to grow. In fact, it triggers hormone responses within the plant to say, oh, it's growing time. So they push out new roots, they push out new leaves. So I have trees that I do that to every year, trees that I do that to every 5-6 years that are older, more slow growing just by their nature. And that's the kind of type of thing that happened with those trees. They kept growing and somebody wasn't taking care of the fact that their entire needs were in that pot. You have to take them out, remove some of the roots, think about what kind of soil is
So they
in
might
the
have
pot,
survived
if they had been properly cared for.
Oh, okay.
And the bonsai effect that they refer to is when it's been in the pot for a long time and you have a very dense root mass, it can slow the growth habit of the tree. And so there are trees that are perhaps about to go to exhibition, where they want them to look their absolute best and stay refined and have those leaves stay small. And it might be at that point where the pot is very full of roots and it's just barely going to get enough to keep those leaves healthy. And that's maybe that bonsai effect that they were referring to. Limited amount of water and nutrients in the pot that the tree gets.
Well, all I can remember, he said the roots became so tiny that it would be like trying to get, drink your drink from the teeny tiny straw.
There's one falsehood in that, in that the tiniest roots, the ones that are 1 cell in size, are the ones that are actually feeding the tree. You want tiny
So
roots.
maybe he was awful.
I think he probably meant it's not about the size of the roots, but the size of the available. So there's so many roots in there, all the roots are trying to take up
Yeah, he
what's
calls it a
very
bonsai
limited
effect.
resources.
Now, when
Yes.
you repot, you use the same pot, or are you putting it in a
That's-
slightly bigger pot?
So that's up to me, but when we're dealing with bonsai, we want the proportion and style of that pot to match the tree. Do I
But
want
often
to
it
use?
could be the same pot.
Right, or I might decide, you know what, I don't think I want white anymore, or maybe I've decided that an oval pot will work a little bit better, and I have a different size or a different color, and so I might repot into a slightly different pot to play with those things. But yeah, the idea would be to take this root mass that fills this pot right now, trim some of it off so that I'm reducing the root mass and creating some space for those roots to grow into over the next couple of years. That is such a loaded question, you have no idea. Bonsai.
And fertilizer also, are you adding? Fertilizer?
Yes, we absolutely add fertilizer. That is one of the most important things that,
Often?
yes, depends on what type of fertilizer you're using.
Okay.
If you use organic fertilizers, like solid organics, those break down slowly over time, and they're designed to gradually feed over like 4 or 5 weeks or so. So if you place solid organics on here, they're getting fertilized essentially every time you water. If you use liquid fertilizers, then yes, you're talking about weekly, probably, sometimes more often. The soil, bonsai professionals use soilless mix. That's a little bit of a falseness in terms of the name. They're usually aggregate pieces, not something that we would call dirt, right? A very common mix, not to get us too deep down the rabbit hole, is lava rock, pumice, which are very similar, coming from similar, they're both, you know, volcanic stones, right? And akadama. Now that's the really weird one, but this is another one of those international Japanese origin issues, because akadama is a particular type of clay from the Akadama region of Japan that, for whatever reason, works better than anything else we can use or find. But that is kind of a clay type thing that holds more moisture. The water needs to be able to flow out of these pretty quickly so that you don't maintain too much moisture. I've lost more trees to rot than anything else over the years.
So that has a hole in the bottom?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, large drainage holes are the trademark of bonsai. Actually, this is pretty solid. It's been in there for a while. This has 5 large holes in the bottom.
It looks like you've wired the tree down.
Absolutely. Another really important part. Roots are super delicate. Like I was saying, the tiniest, like 1 cell thick roots are the ones that are really feeding the tree. And if you have a tree that's in loose, gravelly type of soil and it's not very, and it gets wiggled, and I go, then I kill a bunch of my roots. So you want that to be very stable, very solid. When you look at a tree outside, and they've got these big roots that reach out into the ground, those roots are for stability, right? Those hold it into the ground. Those thick roots that move away from the tree, they're not really doing any, they're the highway that the nutrition flows through, but they're not actually able to collect any nutrition from the soil that the tree is in. That thick root is to anchor it to the ground, and it's the fine roots at the ends that are